on that. Okay, so today we started the chapter on kinship, marriage, and family. Uh, Basically, today we're going to talk about the marriage and family part of things, and then for Thursday we'll talk more about the kinship, gender, and sexuality. So fun stuff. I guess more fun on Thursday than today. Also for today, I gave you a YouTube link to a famous, perhaps the most famous, well, pretty famous, anthropological film, Ongka's Big Moka. Comes to us from 1974. It's pretty grainy, I'll admit. Pretty grainy, yeah. Not HD. They did not do HD, or else it was, it's hard to get the right recording equipment into the field. Probably could have done this better on your iPhone today, but it's a really it's an interesting film to me because it helps us with a bunch, or it helps us to tie a bunch of things together. So I gave you all of these questions to think about as you were watching the film, and they basically tie into the classes that we have in this unit. So we were talking about field work, and I think Ongka's Big Mocha gives you a sense of what field work might be like. And frankly, that it's a lot of waiting around. It might even be a lot of boredom. It's hard to do field work. You have to try and figure out what's going on, trying to observe, participate. You don't maybe understand the language. There are thousands actually of languages, or hundreds, let's say, hundreds of languages, or in the Papua New Guinea highlands, which is where Ongka's tribe is. And a lot of them were not ever, they weren't written languages, so you had to go in and kind of figure things out. And one of the things that's interesting if you're reading the subtitles, and Ongka is going on and on and on and on, and he's making all of these things, and then all of a sudden this little subtitle comes up and says, "Pigs are my life." And so, you're like, well, what was he talking about? Is this like the slowest language in the world? Well, probably he was making these sort of lists of all the things that pigs were good for. And you, as the anthropologist, it's kind of like you're trying to make sense of what this person is saying. And, you kind of get that subtitle. There'd be no way to actually subtitle it all. He was a fantastic speaker, Ongka, a very interesting person in his own right. So a couple things that go back to our classes on culture, fieldwork, and language. We've just been doing the food getting and economics. So Ongka is part of what you would call a horticultural society. They are raising small scale gardening. Those sweet potatoes are very hugely important. And that's what they feed to their pigs. So small scale crops, it's not really agriculture per se. So we have a horticultural society, and then we have these acts, the Moka are these acts of redistribution, so that the stuff is flowing upward to Ongka, who's kind of the big man. We'll read about that in the politics chapter. The stuff is flowing upward, but he gains prestige by giving it away, by being able to distribute it out. And sort of at the very end, of course, he says, they never get to the Moka. It's kind of another terrible thing about fieldwork is you're waiting and waiting for something to happen, and then you have to leave. So, but in the end, he says, I've given you more, I have flattened you, I've knocked you down by giving so much away. So Moka is technically called, as one of you pointed out, it's kind of a business transaction. It's technically the interest, because every time you get, it's also a form of reciprocity. When you give someone something, you have to give back a larger gift over time. And so the Moka is the interest on that, but it's also a form of redistribution. Today, our class is going to be a little bit about kinship, and I guess I maybe should have said sort of the marriage patterns here. We see Ongka involved in a polygynous marriage where he is married to more than one woman. And also you can see, and this goes into the division of labor, how much that actually has a lot to do with the labor requirements here and how he is married I think a fourth or a fifth wife, basically for because he needs her to help feed the pigs. And so it's mainly about the labor here more than it is about how to say, having four or five wives just for what we might think the person would have that many wives for. It's mainly about labor and who can do what. As I said, we'll talk about the political part comes up again. So be watching for this for next week's class on Tuesday. Oh, good day to do politics. A week from today, Tuesday. Great. So a week from today, we'll read about political organization and how Ongka, I mean, you can see in the film, he is trying to persuade his fellow people to do things, but he doesn't have what we call coercive power over them. He can't make them do it. He has no sort of police authority in his society. And then I asked a couple questions about evidence of connection between Ongka and the wider world and what we might call the colonial relationships. We talked about that a lot in the very first class in this unit, how societies were transformed by the introduction. You might have seen that there's a lot of cash circulating around. Ongka himself has a bank account, and they grow coffee actually and sell it into the world market. He's also wearing his favorite shirt, a Do It in the Road t-shirt. Anybody know where that's from? Do It in the Road?
No.
No, you don't. Sad. Famous Beatles song, Why Don't We Do It in the Road? So that became a t-shirt for him. He likes that. He has a sort of a whole bunch of great, he has his great clothing, his hats and things like that. So a lot of kind of interesting colonial stuff going on there, or how they are connected into a wider world, even though they are still doing these mokas and in some ways carrying out their tradition. So this film was back in 1974, and it's part of a series. We probably will watch another not as long film in that series. And it tried to look at different places around the world. And for me, I just thought it was interesting to think about, well, is Ongka's world really disappearing? Because in fact, if you notice in the film, these mokas are getting bigger and bigger. They are actually sort of being revved up. And so in some ways, and you can say that his world was in some ways, these traditions were being revved up by their interconnection. And that's something we'll also be talking about when we get to the chapter on sustainability. A lot of the things that people thought were going to disappear or go away, we also talked about this with the economics chapter, people have been creative and resilient. So a moka is actually kind of like, it's similar to what we talked about in the economics chapter on a potlatch, where it's a redistribution ceremony where you sort of try to give things away and you gain prestige that way. So like I said, I hope you get a chance to check it out. The link is up. We'll consider it, kind of like a reading in the sense that it takes you a while to watch it, but you should be able to take notes and relate it to the other sections of this class. All right. So today we're going to talk about kinship, family, and marriage. Like I said, we'll talk more about kinship, gender, and sexuality in the next class. In this class, we're going to talk mainly about marriage and family, but I wanted to sort of set the stage by talking about what was called Kinshipology. And that is to say that when anthropologists were first doing their research, were first starting out, and we talked about how anthropology is a relatively recent field, they were very interested in how people said that they related to each other, to the extent that they got so into that in some cases the classes in anthropology were basically like all about kinship systems and how different people related to each other and you'd sort of draw all these kinship diagrams, and that would be most of your class, so that people would make fun of anthropology and say, well, you're not studying anthropology, you're studying kinshipology. And so there was a number of reasons why anthropologists were interested in kinship, but part of it was the assumption that kinship was simply a reflection of the sort of facts of life. The facts of life are the biological facts, which were universal, which everybody acknowledged that, men and women must get together to reproduce, and so that everyone would have the same ideas about kinship. And if they didn't have the same ideas, they were assumed to be like, they didn't know what was going on, or that they were primitive, or that they were weird, or that they were not fit for the modern age, or that they hadn't been missionized enough. So this was kind of the assumption that people had 150 years ago, let's say. And so, people got really into this in terms of figuring out how different societies related to each other. What we eventually discovered in anthropology is that kinship is not just biological, or it's partly biological, but it's also a very cultural relationship. So who we consider ourselves related to, how that kinship is made, how we reinforce it, how we give each other resources, how we marry each other, who we can marry, who is sort of within our group, and who is outside of our marriage group, are all ways in which people culturally think about these relationships. So there's not just one way of doing family, and there's not just one way of doing marriage, and there's not just one way of doing kinship. And as we'll talk about in the next class, there's not just one way of doing gender, and there's not just one way of doing sexuality. And so, as one of you put in the comments, if anybody tries to tell you that there's one way that people have always been married and now people are all deviating from that, that is not anthropologically supported at all. If we look anthropologically over time and over societies, people have been getting married in all sorts of ways, and in different and how to say, all the things that we see today and we might think are weird or new, people have been doing for thousands of years all over the world. So we shouldn't get we shouldn't well, I don't know, I want to say we shouldn't get upset. We shouldn't be confused and think that things are suddenly changing now, because when we look cross-culturally, we see that things have always been, as Muckle and Gonzalez tell us, diverse. As I say, different kinds of family arrangements, different kinds of marriage arrangements, and as we'll see in the next class, different kinds of ways of doing even gender and sexuality. So, I want to first talk about being married, forms of marriage. That's that gamut is kind of how you get married. There are two kind of main forms of marriage, one of which we probably know and love, monogamy, until one person gets married to one person, or mono. That's something that we know. And then there are two forms, or actually probably more, but let's just try for two, what we call polygamy, where one person gets married to more than one person at the same time. So we'll talk about both of these forms. Monogamy, like I said, we know this. This is the idea that you are married. One person is married to one person. And monogamy is found, it's found all over the world. It is probably, or it certainly is, if we think about the sort of majority of marriages, even in societies that permit polygamous arrangements, the majority of marriages are of one person to one person. So this is a form that we know and is true in other places. Of course, poly refers to more than one, so more than one person being married to another person. And the most common form, and if we've heard of any form of polygamy, we often just equate polygamy to polygyny or polygyny, which is one man being married to more than one woman. And although this is not the majority of marriage forms, it is a permissible form of marriage, sometimes even considered an ideal in a majority of the world's societies. So the majority of the world's societies actually permit polygyny. Now, in most of the societies that permit polygyny, you have to be, if you're the man, pretty wealthy to pull this off. And so because in most societies you would be sort of at the top, you would need in some ways to have more labor in your household, or you would have to have enough wealth in order to support each of your wives separately. So for example, in some Islamic societies, if you are it is permitted to be polygynous, but you have to be able to have a separate house for each wife. So obviously, if you have enough money to have a separate house for each wife, then you're in a pretty rich stratum of society. And so it makes it kind of complicated in some ways. This is something that you might that people might see as ideal because it's linked to wealth and power. Now, we often sort of bristle at the idea of polygamy. However, a lot of the people who might live in societies where this is permissible would say, well, you say you have monogamy, you say you are married to one person, but what you really have is what we call serial monogamy, which means that you are married to one person for a while, and then you get married to another person for a while, and this may happen 2 or 3 times in our own society. So this is something that we can point to as, well, here we have this monogamous ideal until death do us part. What percentage of marriages actually follow that? Or is it more like sort of one person being married for a while? Now, there's another form of marriage that you probably, that you probably have not heard about, which is one woman being married to more than one man. And this is a very rare form of marriage. It's the rarest form of marriage. It's actually only technically sort of has been officially permissible in certain areas of, say, highland Tibet. And it's almost always a form of what they call fraternal polyandry. Fraternal meaning brothers. So it would be almost always a set of brothers who are married to one woman. And you might ask, well, this sounds probably a little crazy and weird. Where it is practiced, it is seen as a way of keeping the family inheritance instead of splitting it up. If you had 3 brothers, for example, they would all be able to kind of share the inheritance instead of splitting it up among them. And so, like I said, there's a rare form. It does, though, exist. It's almost always called fraternal polyandry. Now, there have been some anthropologists have said that although as an official marriage form, polyandry is pretty rare, there are a number of instances in different societies in which polyandry has been, or forms that are like polyandry have been practiced. So was an interesting article that came out that said, well, actually, if you looked at different societies where where women need resources for their children, there are various societies around the world in which this becomes more common than we might have thought. Like I said, it's still fairly rare in terms of official sanctioning. It may be more, it may have historically been more common than we once used to teach you in anthropology. So a few other things that we can think about in terms of marriage in general. So what does marriage do? Marriage is a way to sort of legalize or sanction sexual relationships. So it makes it possible, legitimate to have sexual relationships. It also is often a way of dividing labor. So you have the division of labor within a household between the spouses, and it legitimates the children or inheritance from that relationship. So there may be, obviously there may be children born outside of a marriage, but in most societies, it is only the children who are legitimated by marriage who would be able to have full inheritance rights of the family property. So since it does these things and has a lot to do with politics and economics, um, in human history, marriages have often been, people talk about arranged marriages, but in many societies, people have sort of tried to steer in some ways, if not deliberately arranged, tried to steer people into certain kinds of relationships. And that's because marriage has these functions that, because it is about inheritance, because it is about labor, because it is about forming alliances with other people or with other groups, this is sort of, and then as one of you put it, it also often involves an economic exchange, like a bride wealth or a dowry payment, because one person is seen as losing on this, so there's often an economic exchange set up. All of these things come into the idea of marriage. And so our idea of marriage, that it's meant to be about love and companionship, is actually a relatively recent idea in human history. The idea that you should get married based on love. Now, that's not to say that in other societies there aren't notions of love, or haven't been. Almost every society has an idea about love, romantic love, companionship, friendship, all of those things in other societies. However, in many societies, they would say, well, that's fine, but it's not solid enough to be the basis for your marriage. Your marriage should be based on, the connections that we need to make. And so they would say that romantic love is too fragile, it's too fleeting. For those of you who've ever been in love, you might notice that sometimes it lasts. Sometimes people fall in love with other people and then they get out of the relationship that they're in because they fell in love with somebody. So they would say in other societies, hey, this is too fragile. You can have your romantic relationships, but the marriage has to be done based on, what we need to do. They might also say that, well, you can grow to love your partner in your marriage. You can grow into that over time. That's not something that you need to start out your marriage. That's something that comes as you go along. So the idea that we should base our marriage on romantic love is actually fairly, when I mean fairly recent, in the last couple hundred years, sort of Jane Austen novel style stuff about, who you should marry based on love and not on being sort of arranged. One of the other interesting things that Muckle and Gonzalez point out to us here is the idea of exogamy and endogamy. So exogamy means that you have to marry people, you can't marry too close. And actually, let me put up the next point to show you that in all societies, there is some form of what we call an incest taboo. And that would be, you can't marry people that are too close to you. Now, this varies from society to society what people consider too close, but in all societies, there is some notion that you have to be exogamous, at least basically from your own kindred. So the exogamy refers to rules about marrying outside of a group. And in some cases, people do, as we saw with hunter and gatherer bands, they would try to marry very far outside their group. And so that would be kind of a preference to marry kind of far away. But there are also ideas about endogamy, which is within group. And so people might say, well, you have to marry another, let's give ourselves an example from our own society. You have to marry another Catholic, right? So you could be religious endogamous, which is to say that, okay, you can't, you really can't go outside of this group. Or you might say, different rules for how inside people must be, or you should marry somebody from your own region or your own hometown. What's, I think, super fascinating, I don't know, is that in the United States, our own marriages, statistically speaking, are extremely endogamous by social class. It is very rare that you will see a marriage between someone who is of the upper class and someone who is of the working class. And it is very rare that you will see people from different social classes being married. It does happen, usually in the movies, but it's very statistically rare. And so we have a sort of a paradox in our society where we say that we only go by love, companionship, we choose who we marry, we never have arranged marriages, and yet, statistically, we almost always marry somebody from our own social class. So how does that happen? How do we believe in love while making sure that people marry? Well, we don't have to, we have to make sure it just somehow happens within their class. And since class and race are actually often so intertwined in our country, our marriages often, even though there's no legal reason now, thank goodness, they often are also very race endogamous. So they're very class endogamous. How does that happen? The first way that happens is basically because of who you grow up with. We live in a society in which the amount of wealth that you have often decides what your housing situation is going to be and what kind of neighborhood you can live in. And so the people that are in your zip code and go to your school are probably going to be, in most cases, of a pretty similar social class to you. So even though we say that we believe in love, we often have to limit ourselves. Of course, it's very difficult, even with the dating apps, to find somebody who doesn't live around us. So we end up being in sort of the same social class. But we have another great way of kind of ensuring that people of the same social class get together, even if they don't grow up together. Anyone know of the best way to make sure people of the same social class will form romantic attachments to each other, even if they didn't grow up in the same town? Yes. College, exactly, you're in it. Unfortunately, it is COVID-limited college right now. This isn't probably working as well as it used to, but college is the way that we sort this thing out. First of all, we sort it out by people who don't go to college. They stay in their own hometown and they're probably gonna then get married to their high school sweethearts, and that's great. But then if you go to college, you're probably going to meet people basically in the same social class. And those are the people you're basically at, the right age to make those romantic attachments. And so, I grew up in Montana. My wife grew up in northern Jersey. We're not even, we were far apart, but we went to the same college, and basically pretty much the people in our college are all of the same social class, so we got along famously. Um, you know, it's a way of sorting our society, and oftentimes college itself, because it's based on admission scores and these kinds of things, ends up sorting people out according to social class as well. Of course, this doesn't work all the time. Sometimes people do other funny things because people are people, but for the most part, like I said, statistically speaking, our marriages are very class endogamous. All right, a couple things about families. Michael and Gonzalez discuss probably what we all know, or what we might call is the typical family, what is called the nuclear family. So this is, you know, the husband, wife, and children. Uh, in some ways, in our society, we have idealized or we prize what are called neolocal nuclear families, so that when people get married, they go into a new place. That's the word neo. They have a new house. You're supposed to have a new house. And in that house, when you get married, then you have the spouses and their children. Uh, in in human history and in many societies, and even in our own societies, it's probably more common to have extended family relationships. So you might have grandparents living with the children, or maybe even uncles and aunts who are connected to and part of the what is called the extended family. Another way of organizing family is to have a matrilocal relationship, so that in this case, the husband leaves wherever he is and basically resides with the wife's family unit. And this is often done, we'll talk about this in the next class, in matrilineal societies. So if inheritance and stuff is being passed down through the mother's line, the husband would relocate and be with the wife's side. Of course, the other side of that is a patrilocal society, so that the wife leaves her place of residence and then lives with the husband's kin and often extended family that way. And so instead of instead of being neolocal, you would be patrilocal, because you would basically, if you were the wife, you would leave your own previous residence and go live with the husband's family. And of course, this is often done in patrilineal societies, as we'll talk about in the next class, where inheritance and stuff is coming down through the male line. But sometimes this can be there can be a little bit of mixing and matching. You can have a patrilineal society that is nevertheless matrilocal, but that's less typical than this. So these are different ways that families can be organized. Of course, we know we have the idea of the nuclear family. So these are some little kinship units here, where you'd have the father, the husband, and the wife, that little equal sign up there, meaning married to each other. And then you'd have a daughter, circles being female and triangles being male, having a daughter and son. So this is what we call the nuclear family, because it has been assumed to be at the nucleus of a family unit. And this is what Michael and Gonzalez describe on page 261. In the United States, we often add in a dog into the family. As Michael and Gonzalez, actually, this is just my question. So Michael and Gonzalez sort of then take this back into the idea of independence training. If you remember how we talked about dependence training and independence training. So typically in a situation in which people have extended families, you would also have childhood raised more as dependents, in the sense that people would be taught that they should always consider themselves as part of an extended family unit, and the family needs are to be prioritized above the individual needs. And so we consider ourselves to be, often in the United States, training people for independence and to start their own neolocal, new household, nuclear families in a new place. And the reason I'm putting this as a question is because for many people in our society, this is becoming an almost, this ideal is not able to be realized, in part because of lack of employment opportunities, in part because of declining wages. And so this also tends to put having a neolocal nuclear family puts a ton of stress on this very limited number of people. And so if there is economic hardship or other forms of stress, it puts a lot of pressure on basically the two people to raise children. And so some people think that one of the reasons we have high levels of let's say marriages that don't work out is because of all the stress that is placed upon this very limited set of relationships. And I think especially now we're seeing that this is a difficult ideal to maintain over time. So some people consider, and again, this is not necessarily saying that there's not anything necessarily wrong with either the nuclear family or right with the extended family, but sometimes an extended family can buffer the economic hardships. You have more people to chip in for childcare and those kinds of things along the way. So so this could be a stressor, and especially in difficult economic times, to try and have a neo-local nuclear family over time. So that's my marriage and family talk. Like I said, we'll do kinship, gender, and sexuality for Thursday's class. Thought we might, because I made you watch an hour-long film, I thought we might have a slightly less extended class today so that you can catch up on things. But questions, thoughts, comments?